Hello, everyone, and welcome to our robotics colloquium. We meet every Friday at 1:30 Seattle time, and welcome distinguished speakers to present their work to us. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Taylor Kessler Faulkner. She's doing her PhD at Austin, working with Andrea Tomas, working on a diverse set of things. And today she's going to be talking about how robots can learn from imperfect human teachers. I'm very familiar with that topic, being a very imperfect human teacher myself. Taylor, before joining Austin, Taylor did her undergrad at Denison University, with a major in computer science and a minor in mathematics and in music. And really excited to have Taylor here. I must also say that she is here interviewing as a postdoctoral candidate to work at the Personal Robotics Lab with me. So super excited about that. And she'll be here for the rest of today in case you're interested in speaking with her. She is currently sitting in my office, and so you can go hang out and talk to her. In terms of questions, Taylor is comfortable taking questions during the talk. We will moderate it so that we can finish on time. But please do unmute yourself and just shout out your question, so we don't have to moderate that in any way. And then we'll await longer questions until the end. So without further ado, welcome, Taylor.
Thank you so much. Really excited to be here and talk to everyone. And I'm looking forward to some of you are meeting later in meetings. Some of you have already met, but definitely if I'm not meeting with you and you'd like to talk, definitely reach out, and I would absolutely love to meet sometime today or later over Zoom, something. So yeah, I am a 6-year PhD candidate, wrapping up my thesis at the moment, and I'm going to be talking about my thesis on robots learning from imperfect human teachers today. We want our lab robots in home and public environments. We want them learning new tasks that will let them be effective helpers and effective team members. And when the robots are out in the world, they should be able to leverage all of the information at their disposal, including the information that they can get from people around them in the world. Now, if we want our robots learning outside of a lab from real people, they're not going to get perfect information in large quantities all of the time, right? They're going to need to learn from both inexpert and imperfect teachers. Now, let's take a scenario in which a robot arrives at someone's. The robot's got some knowledge going in, but it wants to learn some new skills as well. There's many ways that a robot can learn from a human in an environment. There's learning from demonstration, learning from advice, learning from feedback, and tons of subcategories within those. In my work, I mostly focus on learning from human feedback through interactive reinforcement learning. So in this case, let's say that the robot is learning how to set a table by trying out actions and getting a reaction from the person. In a perfect scenario, the person living in the house will be able to observe it the entire time it's learning to set the table, and they'll give perfect feedback to the robot. And they'll let it know immediately when it's done something right and immediately when it's done something wrong, and they'll be an oracle. They'll always be correct in giving the robot feedback. But life is not perfect. There's going to be a lot of noise in the data that the robot's gathering from someone. In their own environment, there's going to be so many distractions for that person. There might be other chores for them to do, times when they can't be at home. They might just get bored after spending an hour trying to teach a robot how to do a new task. In that case, they might be inattentive, and they might only pay attention to the robot intermittently. When this happens, they won't be watching the robot or getting feedback when it's potentially most useful to the robot's learning progress. Or the other option is they might misunderstand the task, what the robot's asking, or even what the robot's capabilities are physically. These incorrect assumptions could lead to them giving incorrect feedback to the learning robot. If the robot gets incorrect feedback during the learning process, it's going to take a lot longer to learn the task, and it might not even learn the task at all. So because of these issues, the question that my research addresses is how should robots learn from imperfect human teachers using interactive reinforcement learning, with this work being divided into algorithms to learn from both inattentive and inaccurate teachers. I chose to work with interactive reinforcement learning because it provides an alternative to full demonstrations from inexperienced human teachers, and the problem formulation with interactive reinforcement learning lets us access both an environmental reward function and human data. Using these two sources of information, my algorithms allow people to take breaks from teaching the robot and decide which teacher provided information to trust. So I'm guessing a lot of you are going to be very familiar with reinforcement learning and a lot of the baseline algorithms that I'm going over, but I'm going to go through some of the basic info quickly just to make sure we're all on the same page. The reinforcement learning allows an agent to learn from interacting with its environment based on a Markov decision process or an MDP. So we'll continue with the example that the agent's goal is to set the table here in someone's home. It's going to put the fork to the left of the plate in this state scenario that we've got set up here. So in an MDP, the state of this environment could be the position of all of the items currently on the table, and the robot's possible actions could be putting the fork in one of 4 places on the table. The transition function gives the probabilities of transitioning between states, and the reward function gives rewards to robots based on the last state action pair. So for my completed work, I've used the Q-learning reinforcement learning algorithm, which updates the Q values of each state action pair based on observed rewards using the Bellman update shown here. Now, RL can be very slow, and it can also get temporarily stuck in local optima while it's learning. While it can get out of local optima by exploring the space instead of exploiting the currently highest valued action, interactive reinforcement learning uses a human in the loop to push the agent out of local optima more quickly because the teacher can be aware of the global structure of the task. Interactive reinforcement learning lets people give feedback in several different ways. One way is having a human feedback replace the reward function entirely, as in the original Tamer algorithm by Knox and Stone, where the agent learns from feedback instead of rewards. So even if there isn't an environmental reward function that the robot has access to, the supervising human can give feedback after watching actions, and those numbers can be interpreted as a reward for the robot. However, giving scalar valued rewards directly can be unintuitive for people. It's not always obvious how to scale the numerical feedback that they're giving to the robot. For example, say that the robot takes a good action. How much numerical praise does that deserve? 1, 10, 100? So to address this, several works in interactive reinforcement learning scale feedback to teachers to just binary positive or negative feedback on agents' actions. My completed work is closely related to one of the algorithms that uses binary feedback, which is called policy shaping. Policy shaping allows the robot to learn both from a reward function and from a human teacher. Using policy shaping, the teacher can give binary positive or negative feedback on the actions that the robot takes. In this algorithm, the feedback that the user gives influences the policy of the robot rather than shaping rewards or acting directly as a reward to the robot. And we chose policy shaping as the baseline algorithm for much of this research because this algorithm does not require scalar feedback from a user, and it also uses an environmental reward function as well as getting human feedback, which provides a system of checks and balances for the learning robot. So to use policy shaping with Q-learning, I'm going to quickly go over some of this prior work and how that mathematically works out. So we start with the Boltzmann Exploration equation, which is often used in reinforcement learning. Based on the Q values of state action pairs, this equation controls how the robot explores while it's learning, based on the Q values that it has observed so far. This equation introduces some randomness into the robot's chosen actions, so the robot doesn't always take the action that it currently thinks is best. This helps the robot find potentially better actions as it's learning. In policy shaping, it is also calculated how likely each action should be for the robot to take based on feedback from the teacher. So we have the Boltzmann equation giving us one probability and another probability coming from the human teacher. And the policy shaping formula is shown here. C is a trust parameter in this equation that's set between 0 and 1, and it's set by an expert based on how accurate the teacher's feedback is expected to be. So for example, if the teacher is expected to be mostly accurate, C can be set to a high number like 0.9. If the teacher is expected to be mostly inaccurate, C can be set lower under 0.5. And with C set to 0.5, this just collapses to basic reinforcement learning without any human feedback. This equation also accounts for potential inconsistency in the human's input using the delta parameter. So here, delta is the difference between the number of positive and negative feedbacks given by the teacher for any state action pair. So if the teacher isn't consistent with their feedback, policy shaping will account for this inconsistency over time. Then policy shaping combines the first two equations, giving us the actual probability of taking an action at any step. This final equation, combining both the information from the reinforcement learning algorithm and from the human's feedback, influences the robot's policy or the actions that it's taking. Now, policy shaping can speed up reinforcement learning because the teacher pushes the robot in the right direction. That's great. But what does it mean if the human isn't giving the robot any feedback at the moment? How should the robot interpret silence? If the teacher is always paying attention, then Cederborg et al. Found that in some cases, silence should be interpreted as positive for the robot. That is, the robot should accept no input as tacit approval of the current policy. But it can be very wrong to interpret silence as positive feedback if the teacher isn't paying attention to the robot. And say the person's gone, the robot places the fork in the incorrect spot on the table. It's going to take the lack of feedback from that teacher who isn't present as positive feedback, and that's incorrect. Many interactive reinforcement learning algorithms assume that a teacher is present whenever the robot might want more information, which may not be true in the real world. Most people will get tired or bored or distracted, and they're going to want to take a break from teaching. So this problem brings us to my first algorithm. So in order to address how the robot should behave differently when teachers are or are not paying attention, we propose the attention modified policy shaping algorithm, or AMPS. AMPS enables robots to take advantage of human feedback while teachers are present. Using our algorithm, robots explore more while teachers are watching in order to gather as much knowledge as possible from them. And then the robots explore less, taking previously proved actions when possible when they do not have attention. And this lets the robot stay in better known areas of the state space without supervision, taking predictable actions when possible. Our algorithms are not focused on the detection of attention, so we do assume that the robot is told when the person is paying attention and when they're not paying attention, but any attention detection algorithm could be replaced here. So while the teacher is present, AMPS exploits their presence by trying new state action pairs, ones that the person hasn't seen and given feedback to. So we choose between actions that the person hasn't observed and actions that the person has responded positively to with a 50-50 chance here. So taking unseen actions if one's available allows the robot to get feedback on new areas of the state space. Taking good actions takes the robot to potentially better areas of the state space here, because the final goal for this is to really find a path of teacher-approved actions towards the goal state. Without attention from a teacher, the robot takes previously approved actions whenever one's available. So this is going to keep the robot from exploring new and unknown areas of the state space when possible, to act more conservatively and predictably when no teachers are watching. And much like leaving a child alone, we'd like the robot to take unsurprising actions when it's unobserved, rather than trying new things and exploring in potentially dangerous areas when it has the option to take a safer action. In a human study, we told the robot when users were present and when they were gone. So the task here is pushing this yellow cup in a grid space. It's a bit hard to see on the screen, but there's a green X at the center front of the table. So the robot's attempting to push the yellow cup to that green X. So we can see the robot exploring less when it does not have attention. There's no one there to give feedback. It tries to follow a good path it's learned with good feedback. And I'm in there resetting it. It's just, continuously taking pre-approved actions when possible. This is actually receiving some feedback from the human. Then when it has attention there, it has someone giving feedback on the screen. It's going to try some different actions to see more of the state space and try to gather more information from the teacher. And that's great because you can see here that the teacher is able to intervene and prevent catastrophes if the robot goes into dangerous territory. And we also ran experiments and simulation for this study. And with a simulated teacher giving intermittent feedback, we find that AMPS is able to learn more quickly than policy shaping. And on this graph, the shaded areas here in green indicate the presence of attention. So we can see that the rewards gathered by AMPS here in blue are going to spike during inattentive periods because it's trying to stick to good actions that have been pre-approved, and those generally lead to better overall cumulative rewards. Now, performance drops during attention, during the areas with no background, because it's trying new things, but we can see that it learns quite a bit during these periods because there's a large spike after the shaded areas. And so the positives of this algorithm are that AMPS was able to learn quickly, gathering more rewards over time than policy shaping, and it was able to take advantage of the feedback it received from teachers. Now, what happens if the robot really needs feedback and the person's gone, they're not paying attention? Or what if it doesn't need any more feedback at all, but the person doesn't know that and keeps returning to give more feedback anyway? We want to give people the freedom to do other things and not pay attention to the robot without having the burden of deciding when to come back and teach. So to address this problem, I developed the algorithm Active Attention Modified Policy Shaping, or Active AMPS. Now, Active AMPS enables a robot to ask for attention from teachers. And people that aren't paying attention to the robot won't be watching the robot. They won't know what it's doing. So they won't be fully aware of the robot's actions and when it needs feedback. We don't want the people to have to think or worry about the robot while they're off doing other things, living their life. We propose that the robot should know when it needs attention better than an inattentive person. So it should alert the person when it's in a state that needs more feedback. The person can get this alert and know that the robot needs more information from them. To allow the teachers to actually take breaks and not annoy the teacher, the robot waits for a predetermined amount of time in between checking whether it needs feedback from the person. So for example, the robot might act for 10 minutes without human attention before checking to see if it needs feedback. As a side note, this method of requesting attention could be modified in the future by using an algorithm such as the work from Professor Srinivasa and Professor Chakmak's lab on modeling human helpfulness. But in the meantime, we're looking at taking breaks and having person be able to say, I want to be able to go away for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour, and then come back. If the robot doesn't need attention from a person after this break period is over, it will keep taking actions until it does need attention. And while the person is gone, it will learn in the same fashion as AMPS. Now, Active AMPS allows the robot to only ask for attention in states that need it. When the robot's in a state and no actions have been marked as good by a teacher, so no actions have been approved to take from this current state, it's going to alert the teacher and pause until they come to give feedback. However, the robot's never going to ask for any feedback when any action in the state has been marked as good, even if it's given the teacher enough of a break. And we use the presence of good actions in this way to decide when the robot needs feedback, because in AMPS, the baseline algorithm, the robot always chooses to take one of the good actions in a state if the teacher isn't present. We tested Active AMPS against Q-learning, policy shaping, and AMPS in simulation. AMPS and policy shaping received feedback every 3 actions, no matter what. This is from a simulated teacher. And then Active AMPS could ask for feedback every 3 actions, but it would ask less if no feedback was currently needed. And Q-learning here, the black line, gets no feedback at all. It only learns from the environmental reward function. We found that Active AMPS outperformed all 3 of these algorithms in simulation. But we can also see that not only did it outperform these algorithms, over time, Active AMPS stopped asking for feedback entirely when it doesn't need it, whereas AMPS continues to receive feedback at the same rate over time. So here the purple is AMPS interval, which gets feedback every 3 actions in this graph on the right. And the green is Active AMPS, and it stops asking for feedback after about 80 actions. So overall, it uses less feedback and it's able to perform better in terms of reward. In a human study, we tested the robot sorting cups on a table. And when they weren't paying attention, participants were hand copying written words, which let us judge how much work the participants could get done while they weren't paying attention to the robot. Now, during the AMPS algorithm, participants had complete control over when they were copying words and when they were watching the robot. So they could copy words the entire time, watch the robot the entire time, do some mix of either. And during an algorithm we title AMPS interval, the robot verbally asks for feedback once every 3 actions, no matter what. Active AMPS asks for feedback at most once every 3 actions, but again, less if feedback wasn't needed. And we measured the amount of feedback that people gave the robot for each algorithm. We have AMPS, AMPS interval, and Active AMPS. And again, AMPS is the one where people can choose exactly how much feedback they want to give. AMPS interval is asking exactly every 3 actions, and Active AMPS can ask at every 3 actions if needed, but will stop asking for feedback eventually. So we found we measured the amount of feedback, and then we also measured the amount of words that the participants were able to copy during this task. And we found statistically significant results showing that people gave less feedback to active AMPs than both AMPs interval and AMPs. And active AMPs did not learn any more slowly than the other algorithms. And the amount of words that participants were able to copy was significantly higher for active AMPs than the other algorithms. So active AMPs was able to learn faster than baseline methods, use less feedback, and allowed people to get more work done than when they were able to choose whether to give feedback to the robot or not. And that covers my inattentive teacher section. But we still have the problem that the robot can get incorrect feedback from people. So robots often expect the feedback that they get from people to be close to optimal, but information from teachers might be partially incorrect. In extreme scenarios, people might even be acting as an adversary, purposefully giving incorrect information to the robot. So ideally, robots would be able to take advantage of both bad and good feedback from external sources. Since the amount of total feedback is often limited, being able to learn from bad feedback as well as good feedback will end up wasting less information, which is a very expensive resource to get from teachers. So prior algorithms in interactive RL include policy shaping, which we went over at the beginning of this talk, and also various methods of combining feedback with rewards that were introduced in Tamer plus RL by Knox and Stone. So these methods all take actions with some probability based on the RL values and the human feedback. So here we see in Tamer plus RL, the H of SA here is looking at a learned human reward function, while the Q of SA is the Q values. Now, what we have here is it uses P and W and C for these trust parameters. So C we have set up for policy shaping. That's the trust parameter we covered earlier from 0 to 1. And then for these two Tamer plus RL methods, P here for the first one is the probability that the agent takes an action determined by the teacher's feedback. And then W weights the human feedback against the learned Q values from an MDP. And P, W, and C, all of these sort of trust or weighting parameters all control how likely the learning agent is to listen to the teacher. So we note that the trust or weight variables, which are again, P, W, and C here, they function very well if feedback is randomly bad. No matter the state, the teacher is a P% likely to give good feedback to the robot. Now, we think it's unlikely that people just randomly give the robot incorrect feedback. Instead, they're going to give bad feedback based on a misunderstanding of the task or how the robot works, which means that certain parts of the task state or action space are going to consistently receive bad feedback. In contrast to these kinds of methods, repair links trust to specific task states to learn when to listen to the teacher. Now, algorithms like policy shaping also assume that the skill of the teacher is a known prior. Other algorithms that account for incorrect teacher feedback use the assumption that feedback's mostly correct, or at least have some threshold of noisiness that people need to be under for the algorithm to perform well. However, the robot often has no knowledge about the quality of the feedback before learning begins. Now, some prior work avoids randomness and the need for prior knowledge by looking for agreement between learned Q values and feedback values. Sridharan keeps track of policies from reward function and one policy from feedback and weights trust based on the agreement between its policy and the reward function policies, but needs to save multiple policies to do that. Now, another method by Lin et al. Bases the trust in teacher by comparing teacher advice and currently learned Q values, as well as the current trust in a deep RL algorithm. Now, at the beginning of learning, unfortunately, Q values and initial policies are still likely to be incorrect, and we'd like to not discount good feedback at the beginning of the robot's learning progress. There's also a whole lot of work that avoids randomness and learns on the fly, but it takes demonstrations rather than feedback. So in my work, I'm focusing on binary feedback instead, as an alternative option to full demonstrations that avoids having to train people how to give these demonstrations to our robot. My algorithm, revision estimation from partially incorrect resources, or repair, acts as a filter between feedback and a robot learning using an interactive RL algorithm. Repair estimates states and actions that are likely to receive incorrect feedback and filters the feedback based on this estimation. In contrast, repair uses the cumulative reward received at the end of each episode to estimate trust and external feedback for specific state action pairs. So this cumulative reward gives us an idea of the overall performance of the robot on each episode, on each trajectory that it tries. So to explain the algorithm, I'm going to step through a couple of example episodes in a very, very simple grid world navigation task. What repair does is it records the entire trajectory from start state to goal state and saves the highest cumulative reward achieved for each state action pair to estimate whether feedback's good or bad. So I'm going to step through this process because I think it's easiest to explain with a few examples. So say these red states indicate danger zones that the agent should avoid. And we have our first trajectory, and the agent gets small negative rewards until it reaches the red space, gets -10. The trajectory ends in a danger state, and this gives a total reward of -14. So then we save R0 or -14 as the maximum total reward seen for each of these state action pairs. Okay, so now say the agent tries another path and gets all of these small negative rewards towards the goal, and then the trajectory ends here. And this is going to give us a total reward of -5. Now, the first three actions that we've seen have been seen for two different trajectories now. In R1, our second cumulative reward we've seen, that's -5, it's a higher observed total reward on those first three actions. So we save R1 as the maximum total reward seen for each of these state action pairs. And the rest of the actions that we've seen them for one trajectory. So either R0 or R1 is the highest that we've seen so far. And we have those marked in the squares on the left. So the decision to save the maximum total reward seen for every state action pair is based on the idea that taking bad actions will lead to low cumulative rewards, and taking good actions leads to high cumulative rewards. So the highest cumulative reward seen in any trajectory with action A from state S is likely to represent the correctness of that action. So then we assign a trust to the feedback. This trust calculation is based on the relative goodness of total rewards based on observed trajectory rewards. Higher saved rewards give a higher trust value on positive feedback, and lower saved rewards give a higher trust value for negative feedback. So the robot will trust positive feedback on actions that it thinks are good, and it will trust negative feedback on actions that it thinks are bad. And we use this information to calculate a trust metric T in the feedback that we're getting. Now, repair uses this calculated trust to determine whether to keep, invert, or discard feedback. So there's three options. We have Tmin and Tmax, which are threshold parameters that are set by the experimenter for each task. And these determine how much we have to trust feedback in order to keep it, and how much we have to distrust feedback in order to discard it or flip it, invert it. If the trust is greater than or equal to Tmax, repair lets the feedback pass through. Otherwise, repair discards the feedback entirely. Or sorry, let me say that again. If the trust is less than or equal to Tmin, repair passes through the feedback, opposite feedback to the robot. So it says, let's not listen to this feedback at all. In fact, let's listen to the opposite. Now, if the trust is greater than or equal to Tmax, repair passes the feedback through, and then otherwise it discards the feedback entirely. So this method lets us use both correct and incorrect feedback to learn. If the trust parameter is uncertain, we do filter feedback out. But if our trust is high, we can keep the feedback without having to not have to trust it enough because we think that there's some incorrect feedback coming in. So we can fully trust this feedback that we think is correct. And then if our trust is very low in this feedback, we're going to flip it. And in this case, the feedback is binary. So we're simply interpreting negative ones as ones and ones as negative ones. And so this lets the robot learn from incorrect feedback as well. So this is giving additional information to the learning robot that's not just the correct feedback that's coming in. In experiments, we compared repair against 3 baselines, which were policy shaping and 2 versions of combining feedback with rewards that were introduced in Tamer plus RL. So we're going to refer to these 2 versions as Tamer P and Tamer W because those are the weighting parameters that they use. And both combine these H of SA, the learned human reward function, with the learned Q values from an environmental reward function. And now, as a reminder, repair is not a learning algorithm by itself. It's just a feedback filter. So we're going to test each of these algorithms both with and without the repair filter. So in simulation, the task is defined as follows. The agent has 16 identical objects and must learn to place 4 objects in bin 1 and 2 objects in bin 2. And these objects can be placed and removed one at a time. And the agent can choose to end the task at any time, and in fact, has to choose to end the task to end a learning episode. We test multiple levels of feedback quality in simulation. The Oracle feedback quality is varied in our experiments by picking some percentage of states, which are 0 to 100 in increments of 20%, and we're going to set those states to all receive correct feedback. We choose these states at random. So we take all of the states, pick some percentage, say 40%, and no matter what action the robot takes in these randomly chosen states, it receives correct feedback from an oracle. In the rest of the states, it always receives incorrect feedback. This simulates a person that misunderstands in a certain subset of states, either how the robot functions or what the task parameters are. Now, one advantage of repair is that it allows a single trust value or weight parameter to be used across a wide variety of feedback reliability. So here again, we're referring to these C, P, and W trust parameters from the baseline learning algorithm. The robot often isn't going to know how good the feedback is going to be ahead of time. If it did, it could set these weights and adjust them. That would be easy. But repair enables the robot to avoid this process, since there's often no knowledge going into an interaction, whether the person is going to be good or bad at teaching. So when we filter our feedback through repair, we set the trust parameters or the weights to 0.8, because this value weights feedback positively, but it does not trust it fully. And when we're not filtering with repair, the trust parameters are varied from 0 to 1 for the baseline algorithms to see how many trust settings for those original baselines will outperform the repair filter with the trust parameter set to 0.8. And these variations in the baseline are going to be shown in the graph as blue dots. So dark blue dots are going to indicate high trust settings and light or low. So when we see a dark dot, that means that the baseline algorithm fully trusts the teacher. When we see lighter dots, that means that the learning algorithm does not trust the teacher. So as an example, we see here an policy shaping plus repair. And I'm going to make a quick note that the y-axis is measuring total reward, so higher is better. And the x-axis measures how much correct feedback the robot is getting. So green here, the green line is using the repair filter with a single trust parameter. The purple line is Q learning, which takes no feedback. And the blue points here are the baseline points with no filter. So we're going to note that for all of the baselines, performance is poor when there's a mismatch between the baseline's trust parameter and the actual feedback quality. So that is high trust, which are the dark blue dots, perform very poorly when the agent is receiving bad feedback. And when the agent has low trust, in the light dots, they perform very poorly with good feedback. So you can see, for example, the dark blue high trust dots rise in performance as we look from left to right because the feedback is improving in quality. In contrast, repair, the green line here, is performing highly with a single trust setting of 0.8 across all of these percentages of correct feedback. For our results, we measure the percentage of these baseline trust settings that perform significantly better or worse when the baseline is filtered through repair. So that is, we determine when filtering through repair matches or exceeds the performance of our baselines over multiple different feedback weights. What we found was that over all feedback quality levels, add and repair matched or exceeded baseline performances over the majority of T settings in greater than or equal to 83% of cases across all of the learning baseline algorithms. So the takeaway from this is that what Repair can do is it can improve performance if you don't know which trust setting to use. It can be outperformed by an algorithm if it knows exactly how good a teacher is going to be. But if that's an unknown quality ahead of time, our algorithm performs more stably. So we also ran an experiment on the physical robot, but with a different task. And this task is to learn how to grasp a cup on a table by moving its gripper above the table in cardinal directions on a 4x4 grid, and then reaching down to grasp when it's over the cup. And the robot's eye view is shown here. We can see the vision that the robot has. And the robot receives a reliable reward function from detecting whether its gripper is fully closed after attempting a grasp. And the episode ends if the robot attempts a grasp or after a maximum of 16 actions when it times out and resets. Feedback is derived from vision using a 3D computer vision package to locate the position of the cup relative to the robot's gripper. So what we get here is that the gripper is perceived to move closer to the cup according to the computer vision. Then the robot receives positive feedback, and then it receives negative feedback otherwise. Now, this system doesn't have a memory, so when the arm gets in between the cup and the camera, the visual system can't perceive the cup, and thus it gives negative feedback to the robot because the gripper's not getting closer to any perceived cup position. This provides the state space with incorrect feedback. And we're going to see here an example of the robot learning the task. It's using policy shaping as the baseline algorithm, but has the repair filter. And then we'll just fast forward to after about 22 minutes of training, and we can see that the robot has learned to fully pick up the cup. So on the robot, policy shaping with C set to 0.2, which is a moderate distrust in the teacher, performed the worst because the teacher, the feedback was generally good. Now, policy shaping with C set to 0.8, or a moderate trust in the teacher, did improve. That's over on the right-hand side. Then finally, adding repair with C equals 0.8 did perform the best. These results weren't statistically significant. We need to run more to get significance, but it did show that a physical robot can learn a task using feedback filtered through repair, and also suggests that using repair may improve performance. So to summarize, using repair improves or matches expected baseline performance for greater than or equal to 83% of feedback qualities. And it performs well on a physical robot. The robot is able to learn using policy shaping with a repair filter. So to recap all of these algorithms for my thesis, the robot is learning a task from a person. And using AMPS, the robot can take advantage of the person's feedback when they're present and also continue learning when the person has to leave. Now, using active AMPS, the robot can call a teacher back when it needs them. The person won't have to think about the robot while they're away, and the robot can get feedback when it's needed. And then using repair, the robot can filter out incorrect feedback from the teacher. So there's several directions for my research that I'm currently considering for future work. I should be finishing up my PhD in the spring and hoping to pursue something like these kinds of directions in a postdoc. So my current work is focused on extending my algorithms to more complex and continuous state spaces. A lot of my work has been done in discrete spaces, and to finish out my PhD, I'm looking to use machine learning methods to work on reducing the amount of storage space and information required to learn whether input is correct, and also be able to use less feedback to learn over larger state spaces. I'm also interested in methods that make it easier for inexperienced users to provide information to learning robots. So a project that I'm focused on now is focused on using language audio signals from users to improve the quality of the experience for teachers, as well as using prosody information from the audio to inform the learning process. And using language may help people feel more comfortable giving feedback than pressing buttons, and the expressiveness of the human voice translates into more detailed feedback than some other methods. This also allows us to have a method of getting information from teachers that's fairly natural. And I'm also interested in algorithms that are going to enable robots to teach the users while learning is happening. So in order to make the teachers better, the robots can provide information algorithmically. Now, methods that let robots show people their capabilities and question information may help people learn how to be better teachers overall. So this can be more of a symbiotic relationship where the human is teaching the robot, but the robot's also helping the human to become a better teacher. And these kinds of algorithms are steps towards robots interacting with real people and real environments. And we expect our robots to be out working with people, interacting with them, and the robots are going to run into inexpert users. People are great at teaching and interacting, but they're definitely not perfect. And my goal is for robots to be able to interact with and learn a task from any user they might come across outside of the lab setting. My algorithms are designed to put less strain on the humans interacting with the robots, while also enabling the robots to learn more quickly and robustly. Thanks so much. And I have some of the papers listed here, as well as my information, and really appreciate everyone coming to the talk and listening.
Thank you very much, Taylor, for the great talk. Sid had to go, so I'll handle the Q&A. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Yeah, I have a question. First, thanks so much for the talk. Very informative and very well presented, good material. A lot of the work that you presented here seems grounded in this kind of idea that maybe I like buy a robot and then bring it home and then kind of work on training it kind of one-on-one. But I'm wondering, like it seems like a lot of this work has ties to kind of like how to optimally allocate limited human labels, which I know also comes up a lot in supervised learning, right? If I want to kind of like optimize the amount of money I spend on Turk workers and stuff like that. And I'm wondering if you can maybe talk a little bit about the connections or provide some ideas about how I might like also use these algorithms if say I'm not just teaching one robot, but I'm teaching 50 and I have to kind of decide which one to teach at which, at which time step or something like that. Is this something you thought about?
It's not something that I've worked on specifically in my past research, but it is definitely something that I've thought about. And I think one place that it is specifically very applicable to what I'm working on is in the attention modified policy shaping that I'm working on, particularly the active attention modified policy shaping. So if you are one person, you have very limited attention to give to, say, 50 robots or however many that you're working with. If they could tell you when it was best to give each individual one attention, then that would make that process a lot easier for you. So I think that that's a really interesting area where it could be applied as far as having multiple robots to one unavailable human teacher. So that teacher will be inattentive to many robots while it is paying attention to one specifically. And I think that applies quite nicely there.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I have perhaps like an inverse question of Aaron's, which instead of asking about multiple robots, I'm curious about like multiple human teachers as well as like different queries from human teachers. So like, a concrete example is I'm thinking about the robot assisted feeding setting, right? And there's a user in the chair who has like limited capabilities to help the robot, but is most, closest and most directly invested. There's a caregiver who has more abilities, but like maybe their coming could like disempower the user. There might be remote helpers who might be experts, but their help might be latent. And like, this just seems like such a broad space when you have multiple people, different trade-offs of like latency or empowerment or like different capabilities, different ways of asking for help. And I'm just, curious to get some of your initial thoughts on like how we can start taking these algorithms that are focused on like one teacher, one type of question and put it in these more complicated real world scenarios.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's great, and there is work doing this, is having more humans to ask from. You can start to compare their answers to each other. So if you're in a setting like my work on learning from incorrect teachers, you might have one expert. You don't get it very often. It's kind of like my sparse reward function, right? So you might get some expert input, but you can't get it very often, or it's coming in after the fact. And then you have maybe an expert, 2 or 3 or 4 inexpert teachers that can give you more immediate feedback. And I think that, there's really cool work that's comparing if you have an ensemble of incorrect teachers that are incorrect in different ways, then you can really start to use them to learn overall what a correct teacher would look like, which is very cool. But I do think there's a lot of ways to go in that area for sure, because everyone's going to have a different teaching style, but of course you could always have multiple teachers who all have exactly, pretty much the same misunderstanding of the state space or how the robot works, particularly if you have two people who are in the same environment and trying to learn to use the robot at the same time. So I think a little bit of personalization to each person on learning over time, who's more correct, who's more incorrect, who should I listen to, but also balancing them with each other and being able to combine all that information is super interesting problem, and one that would be really cool to look at.
That's helpful and really interesting. Thanks.
It's a good question.
Hi, Taylor. I also have a question.
Hi.
Hi. So in the repair framework that you mentioned, you said that if the agent has access to the quality of the feedback, it can perform better, but it doesn't. So what about using the trust parameter that you received from the cumulative reward instead of using it to repair, but using it directly the continuous value as? So is this something?
Yeah, and it is also something that I'm kind of looking into now. So I think that if you just use the cumulative reward to adjust that trust parameter, that's going to work well. And I think we can use that to our advantage. But also, if that's all you're doing, then again, you get into the issue that I pointed out earlier, where there's a pattern. People have a pattern to giving incorrect feedback. And if you're discounting, if you're learning over time exactly the percentage of when people are wrong, but you're using that to discount everything, then you're not in a great position. Now, if you want to use it to set the trust parameter differently for different areas of the state space, I think that's a great start for that. But again, if you just set the trust parameter to 0 or whatever when you're getting bad feedback, it's not actually doing the opposite. So I'm adding a little bit of extra information in to the learning robot. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Cool.
Thank you.
So you mentioned at the end in your future work that you kind of envision that the robot itself could actually inform the human for how to give better feedback. Have you thought of how you could operationalize that? Like, what would it take to get to that part?
I think it will take quite a bit to get there, but I think one of the things to start with is once you do have the robot learning a pattern of where the person is giving you incorrect feedback, if you have a way to communicate to the user, hey, I'm noticing that your feedback in this area is not matching up with my reward function. Let me show you a capability I have that I think you don't know I have, or let me show you I can't actually move my arm to the position that you would like me to move my arm to. So just passing a little bit more information along from what the robot has learned about the pattern of the human's feedback, I think is a good, an interesting first step to take into this. And some of it's just, transparency in machine learning. So there's a, I know there's a lot of work going on in this sort of area, but I think having it, informing it, and actually doing studies with humans, can we make them understand the task better, the robot better as they're teaching? I think that would be a very interesting first step.
Cool. Maybe one more question. I guess I was thinking, did you get a sense of what participants thought of this whole framework, like coming to the lab and participating in it? What did they think about, the process of actually teaching the robot?
Sure.
Maybe that's a broader question, I guess, of this whole field, but how did it feel?
Yeah, okay,
what are your insights?
Yeah, a couple of things. One, I will say that people were pretty excited to use the robot. The most of the people that I had coming in, a lot of them were grad students, undergrads, but they hadn't seen the robot before, they hadn't interacted with it, they hadn't been able to teach a robot. And so they thought that was pretty cool. It was very fun for everyone to see the robot learning, but there were definitely frustrations that were happening there. And there's frustrations that are going along with my algorithms as well. So, it works really well for the robot's learning capabilities in the AMPs, the attention modified algorithms, for the robot to try new actions, do random actions, do a lot of exploration while the person's paying attention, and then try to do better when the person's gone because it's more predictable. But it did start to annoy people a little bit that every time they came there, like, the robot isn't learning anything. And so I started after each experiment, I would show people that in fact the robot had learned how to do the task at the end, after the experiment was totally over and we'd finished all the data gathering. I'd say, look, no, you were able to teach the robot to push the cup to the center. It was just, trying to learn a lot, and that made people feel better. But I think there's a lot to learn there. There's a line between curiosity and annoyance as far as not listening to the teacher. And I think I haven't, I'm still getting in human data on some of the incorrect teacher things, but I'm wondering if I'm going to see the same thing. So if the robot's just completely not listening to them because it thinks that they're wrong in a specific area of the state space, that may be great for the robot's learning, but is that going to be really annoying for people to work with? So I think that's an interesting area. How do we balance the robot's learning capabilities with function, and not making our human teachers want to quit teaching because it looks like the robot isn't learning properly? But overall, I would say that people were pretty interested in coming in. But I would, as I mentioned, I think adding different modalities would make this even more interesting because, I'm looking at button clicks, I'm looking at positive yes and no, just binary feedback, which was very easy for people to learn how to do, which was what I wanted from that system. But I do think that it could be made more interesting by having more varied modalities of input.
Yeah, I think that's going to be especially relevant, given that you're also interested in assistive feeding and that space. I think handling those is definitely an important factor in ensuring comfort, minimizing frustration, and all that.
Exactly.
Cool. Let's thank again Taylor. Thanks so much for the talk. And as you know, as we said, Taylor will be around for a few more hours today. So feel free to go say hi. She's in 242. Is that the number?
I think so.
Okay. Awesome.
I'm in Sid's office.
CSC2. Yeah, that's easier. Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.